The flying tank, Robert Johnson, and the P-47 Thunderbolt at 28,000 feet. Second Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson gripped his control stick, his P-47C Thunderbolt flying at the rear of his squadron's formation. Minutes earlier, the 56th Fighter Group had crossed the English Channel. 48 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts were flying escort for B-17 bombers returning from a strike on Villoubet airfield near Paris. Just weeks before, Johnson had achieved his first victory. He was a 23-year-old from Lorton, Oklahoma, still getting to grips with the brutal calculus of air combat over occupied Europe. Johnson, the son of a mechanic, had grown up poor during the Depression. By working odd jobs and saving every penny, he earned his pilot's license the day before his 16th birthday. Now, he piloted one of the largest, heaviest single-engine fighters ever constructed, 7 tons of metal and fury powered by 18 cylinders of American engineering. The enormous Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine in front of him generated 2,000 horsepower, turning a 13-foot propeller that could pull the Thunderbolt through the sky at a speed exceeding 400 mph. The ambush and the anatomy of survival. Then the sky erupted. 16 Focke-Wulf FW, 190 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's most elite units, dove out of the sun from 32,000 feet. The Thunderbolts were scattered by the first pass. Johnson's aircraft, flying tail end Charlie, bore the concentrated fire of multiple German fighters. 20mm cannon shells tore into his fuselage. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic lines ruptured, spraying fluid into his eyes and across his face. Shrapnel from a cannon shell peppered his right leg. The tip of his nose was creased by a machine gun bullet. The engine caught fire. Johnson desperately tried to bail out, but he found his canopy jammed, damaged by cannon strikes. It would only open 6 inches, not wide enough for him to squeeze through with his parachute. The fire went out on its own, its fuel supply starved by the ruptured lines. But Johnson was struggling to control the aircraft, half blind, his eyes swollen shut from hydraulic fluid burns. His fighter had absorbed at least 21 direct 20mm cannon hits and over 207.792 text and emitter machine gun strikes. Any other fighter would have disintegrated. Most pilots would have been dead. Yet Johnson and his Thunderbolt kept flying. This moment would become one of thousands that fundamentally changed how German fighter pilots understood American engineering philosophy. The Luftwaffe had been trained on aircraft that prioritized elegant efficiency, speed, and maneuverability. Every gram of weight was scrutinized. Every design choice was optimized for performance. The Americans, it seemed, had constructed something completely different. They had built a flying tank. In that difference lay a revolution in fighter design that would influence aviation for generations. The German aces, the most skilled fighter pilots in the world, men who had shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft, were about to learn a humbling lesson. Skill and firepower meant nothing if your enemy simply refused to fall. The P-47 Thunderbolt's story is not just about an aircraft. It is about the collision of 2 engineering philosophies, 2 ways of thinking about survival, and 2 approaches to warfare itself. And it begins with a simple, terrifying question that German pilots ask themselves after every encounter with this massive American fighter. Why won't it go down? Engineering for survival, the Republic P-47. Thunderbolt entered service with the United States Army Air Forces in November 1942. At first glance, it seemed to violate every principle of fighter design established during the first 3 years of the war. The P-47D variant, the most common model, weighed 17,500 pounds at maximum takeoff weight, making it the heaviest single-engine fighter of the conflict. For comparison, the Supermarine Spitfire weighed about 9,500 pounds. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G weighed 7,500 pounds, and the Focke-Wulf FW-190A weighed 10,800 pounds. The P-47 was nearly twice the weight of Germany's most successful fighter. German intelligence officers, analyzing reports and photographs from early encounters, dismissed it as a mistake, a transitional design that would be quickly replaced. They were catastrophically wrong. Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer who had immigrated to America in 1927 and joined the Republic Aviation Company, successor to Seversky Aircraft, designed the Thunderbolt. His design philosophy fundamentally differed from European approaches. European designers obsessed over weight reduction, streamlining every component. Kartveli, however, built for survivability above all else. The P-47's airframe was constructed with unprecedented structural strength. The main wing spar was a single piece of forged aluminum, 4 inches thick at its center and tapering to 2 inches at the wingtips. This spar could withstand 12 G-loads without failure, 3 times the force that would tear apart a Messerschmitt Bf-109. The fuselage was built around the massive Pratt and Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine. Crucially, the entire aircraft was surrounded by protective structures that would prove revolutionary. Between the pilot and the engine sat the turbocharger system, oil coolers, intercoolers, and, most importantly, multiple fuel tanks. Early P-47B and C models carried 305 gallons internally. The bubble canopy P-47 D-25 through D-40 variants, the most common in combat, carried 370 gallons. Late-war P-47N variants, developed for Pacific service, carried an extraordinary 556 gallons. Every gallon was stored in self-sealing tanks, a technology that proved decisive. Self-sealing fuel tanks were not new. The British had developed them, and the Americans had improved them. But the P-47's implementation was unprecedentedly effective. Multiple layers of a rubber compound surrounded each fuel cell. This compound would swell and seal when exposed to gasoline, closing bullet holes within seconds. German pilots discovered this the hard way. Attacks that would have sent any other fighter down in flames simply punched holes that sealed themselves. The P-47 kept flying. The armored bathtub and the psychological defeat pilot protection extended well beyond the fuel tanks. The pilot sat in what American ground crews affectionately called an armored bathtub, though the term understated its effectiveness. Substantial armor plating protected the pilot from virtually every angle. The seat was backed by face-hardened steel armor capable of stopping 20mm cannon rounds at close range. Additional armor plating was contained in the headrest. Beneath the seat, another armor plate protected against ground fire during low-altitude attacks. In front, a thick bulletproof glass windscreen could stop even 30mm cannon shells. German pilots, accustomed to aircraft where armor was minimal to save weight, found themselves facing an opponent who could absorb hits that would instantly kill them. Major Heinz Bär, the third highest-scoring German ace with 220 victories across all fronts, later described his frustration in post-war interviews. The P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. We could hit them repeatedly with our cannon. We could see our rounds striking, but the pilot never fell. The Thunderbolt pilot could sit there absorbing our fire, waiting for his moment to return fire. It was psychological warfare. We knew we were hitting them, but they wouldn't die. The first major air battle that revealed the P-47's extraordinary toughness occurred on that June afternoon in 1943. Jagdgeschwader 26, commanded by some of Germany's finest pilots, had jumped Robert Johnson's squadron, tactics that had worked brilliantly against P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks failed completely against the Thunderbolt. Johnson's badly damaged fighter initially plummeted, spinning toward the earth. Fighting barely responsive controls and half-blind from hydraulic fluid burns, he managed to level the wings and pull out of the dive through enormous physical effort. Why won't it go down? The Legacy he turned northwest, nursing his crippled aircraft toward England at minimum speed, unable to properly see through his burning eyes and damaged canopy. Then a single FW-190 appeared behind him. The German pilot, likely Oberleutnant Egon Meyer of JG-2, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful bomber destroyers with over 100 victories, closed in to finish off the straggler. Meyer had expended his 20mm ammunition destroying B-17s earlier in the mission, but his .92 Text Emmentaler's machine guns still functioned. He made repeated passes, each time raking Johnson's Thunderbolt with accurate fire. Johnson could only slow his aircraft to just above stall speed and slew it left and right, making himself a harder target. He even fired back blindly during Meyer's passes, though damaged controls and compromised eyesight prevented accurate aim. Meyer made pass after pass. Each time bullets struck Johnson's fighter, the P-47 kept flying. After the third attack, Meyer apparently ran out of ammunition entirely. According to Johnson's account, verified by his wingman who caught up moments later, Meyer pulled alongside the battered Thunderbolt, close enough for Johnson to see him clearly. The German pilot looked at the devastated American fighter, still somehow flying, then waggled his wings in salute and turned back toward France. Johnson continued toward England alone. He made it to RAF Manston in Kent, barely able to see the runway through his oil-covered windscreen and swollen eyes. His landing gear miraculously still functioned. He touched down and rolled to a stop. Ground crews counted the damage in stunned silence. 21 direct 20mm cannon hits. More than 207,792 text mem machine gun strikes. The entire tail section was shredded. The canopy was destroyed. Control cables were severed. Hydraulic systems were demolished. The aircraft was declared beyond economical repair and used for spare parts. But Johnson walked away with relatively minor injuries. He would return to combat 5 days later. By the end of his tour in May 1944, he would score 27 aerial victories, becoming one of America's top aces and the first U.S. fighter pilot in Europe to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's World War II record of 26 kills. The significance of Johnson's survival extended far beyond one pilot's luck. Major David Schilling, the 56th Fighter Group's operations officer, immediately recognized that the P-47's survivability changed fundamental combat doctrine. In reports filed throughout the summer of 1943, now preserved in Air Force Historical Research Agency archives, 56th Fighter Group commanders documented a tactical revolution. American pilots could withstand punishment that would destroy any other fighter. This allowed for aggressive tactics that would be suicidal in lighter aircraft. P-47 pilots could pursue attacks longer, press home deflection shots that required flying through enemy fire, and most critically, protect bombers by staying in combat rather than breaking off to avoid damage. The Thunderbolt didn't just survive. It allowed American pilots to fight differently. German fighter commanders quickly realized they faced a fundamental problem. Their entire tactical doctrine was built around energy fighting, using speed and altitude advantage to make slashing attacks, then escaping before the enemy could respond. Against the P-47, this doctrine failed. The Thunderbolt could absorb the initial attack, then pursue, and in any extended combat, the P-47's advantages became overwhelming. Its 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, while individually less powerful than German 20mm or 30mm cannons, fired at a combined rate of 7,200 rounds per minute. More importantly, the American machine guns were extraordinarily reliable, rarely jamming even in extended combat. German cannons frequently malfunctioned, leaving pilots defenseless at critical moments. The new reality of air warfare. By the summer of 1943, German tactical directives began reflecting this reality. Documents captured after the war revealed the Luftwaffe's growing concern. Fighter wings issued instructions emphasizing the need to achieve kills on the first attack pass. Pilots were explicitly warned not to assume visible strikes meant the aircraft was finished, not to assume fire or smoke meant imminent destruction, and not to remain in combat with damaged Thunderbolts that were often still fully capable of fighting. These directives represented a fundamental admission. The Luftwaffe's best pilots, flying aircraft they believed superior, were being told to avoid extended combat with American fighters. The impact on German morale was profound. The summer and fall of 1943 brought the strategic bombing campaign into full intensity. American B-17 and B-24 bombers struck deep into Germany, targeting oil refineries, aircraft factories, and ball-bearing plants. The P-47 groups, now numbering multiple complete fighter groups with plans for many more, escorted the bombers. German fighter wings, under desperate pressure to stop the bombers, threw everything into the attacks. The results proved devastating for the Luftwaffe, not in terms of aircraft destroyed, but in terms of pilot morale and tactical effectiveness. Attacking bomber formations meant flying through fields of defensive fire from both escorts and bombers. The B-17's guns could damage fighters, but rarely destroyed them with single hits. The P-47's guns destroyed anything they hit. But more demoralizing was watching American fighters continue flying, despite damage that should have been fatal. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, fourth highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, flew one mission against American bombers in the West in August 1943. He never flew against them again. In post-war interviews, he explained, "On the Eastern Front, if you hit a Russian fighter solidly, it went down. The LA-GG-3, the Yak-1, even the later models, they were fragile compared to Western fighters. In the West, I attacked a Thunderbolt from a perfect position. I was close. I had time. I fired everything. I saw pieces flying off, strikes on the fuselage, the wings, the tail. The American never wavered. He turned on me and nearly shot me down. I told my commander I preferred to remain in the East. The mathematics were better. This sentiment became increasingly common among Luftwaffe pilots. The Eastern Front, despite being numerically more dangerous, was psychologically preferable. Russian fighters could be destroyed. American Thunderbolts seemed indestructible, the triumph of durability. The statistics supported this perception. During 1943, the P-47 combat loss rate per sortie was 0.7%, compared to 1.2% for Spitfires and 1.4% for P-38 Lightnings. More tellingly, over 90% of P-47s that returned with battle damage were repaired and returned to service within 1 week. The aircraft could be shot full of holes and keep flying, then be patched and fly again the next day. The engineering philosophy behind this survivability became clearer as German intelligence gathered more information. Captured P-47s were shipped to the Rechlin testing facility in Germany, where Luftwaffe engineers conducted detailed examinations. Their reports, discovered in German archives after the war, revealed both admiration and frustration. German engineers noted that the P-47 used construction techniques and materials that prioritized durability over minimum weight. Where German fighters used thin aluminum stampings riveted together with as few fasteners as possible, the P-47 used thicker gauge aluminum with more robust fastening. Where German designs used single-load paths for efficiency, the P-47 featured redundant structures. If one spar was damaged, another could carry the load. If one control cable was severed, backup cables existed. The aircraft was designed on the assumption that it would be damaged in combat and needed to bring the pilot home anyway. One German technical report from late 1943 captured the philosophical difference. The American design is inefficient by our standards. They use substantially more material than necessary for basic structural integrity. They accept significant weight penalties for redundant systems. They sacrifice maneuverability for protection. Yet in operational terms, their philosophy is devastatingly effective. Their pilots survive to fly again. Our pilots and our lighter, more maneuverable fighters die in greater numbers. The Americans have solved a different problem than we have. We built fighters to win dogfights. They built fighters to win wars. The changing tides of war, this observation cut to the heart of the matter. German engineering excellence had produced aircraft of extraordinary performance. The Bf 109 was faster than the P-47 at most altitudes below 25,000 feet. The FW-190 could outturn it. The Me-262 jet, entering service in 1944, was faster than anything the Allies possessed. But performance meant nothing if the pilot didn't survive to use it. The P-47's designers understood that fighter combat was ultimately about pilot survival. An experienced pilot in a less maneuverable but more survivable aircraft would defeat a novice in a high-performance aircraft. Critically, the survivable aircraft would produce more experienced pilots because they lived long enough to gain that experience. The fall of 1943 brought a new phase in the air war. Long-range escort missions pushed deeper into Germany. The P-47, equipped with jettisonable external drop tanks, now had sufficient range to escort bombers to targets that had previously been beyond fighter protection. German fighter commanders faced an impossible situation. Pilots reported that destroying Thunderbolts required ammunition expenditure far beyond normal combat expectations. Most pilots fired their entire ammunition load at a single P-47 without bringing it down. This meant that even if they survived the encounter, they had to return to base without ammunition, unable to engage bombers or other fighters. Entire German fighter wings were being rendered combat ineffective, not by being shot down, but by being forced to waste ammunition on unkillable American escorts. General Major Adolf Galland, commander of all German fighter forces from November 1941 to January 1945, issued directives attempting to address this problem. In October 1943, he ordered pilots to ignore American fighters and focus exclusively on bombers. The theory was that bombers were the real threat. Fighters were just escorts, and destroying the bombers would end the campaign. The directive failed catastrophically. American fighter pilots, freed from defensive concerns by their aircraft's survivability, became even more aggressive. They would dive on German formations, fly through initial defensive fire, then systematically destroy German fighters as they tried to attack bombers. First Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, flying with the 56th Fighter Group, became the embodiment of this aggressive philosophy. Gabreski, the son of Polish immigrants, had personal motivation beyond military duty, as his relatives still lived in Poland under Nazi occupation. He flew every mission as if it were personal vengeance. His tactics exploited the P-47's strengths perfectly. He would identify German fighters attacking bombers, dive on them from above, withstand their defensive fire if they tried to turn on him, then destroy them with massed machine gun fire at close range. Between August 1943 and July 1944, Gabreski would shoot down 28 German aircraft, making him the top American ace in Europe. His survival through hundreds of combat missions, many seeing his aircraft badly damaged, became legendary. The workhorse and the ground attack role, the winter of 1943-44, brought the most intense period of air combat in the European theater. Germany's aircraft industry was under relentless attack. Luftwaffe fighter strength, despite desperate production efforts, was being ground down by attrition. Experienced German pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The P-47 groups, meanwhile, were growing stronger. New pilot training in the United States emphasized the P-47's survivability as a core teaching point. Instructors told students explicitly, "Your aircraft can take damage that would destroy anything else. Use that advantage. Press your attacks. The Thunderbolt will get you home." Major Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, institutionalized this aggressive philosophy into formal tactics. The formation that became known as the Zemke Fan was designed to maximize the P-47's strengths. Instead of traditional close formations that restricted maneuverability, Zemke's fighters flew in loose, flexible groups that could respond quickly to threats. When German fighters attacked, the P-47s would not turn away defensively. Instead, they would turn into the attack, forcing head-on encounters where the P-47's armor and firepower gave it overwhelming advantage. German pilots accustomed to enemies who would evade found themselves facing Americans who deliberately flew into their fire, absorbed it, then returned devastating fire of their own. By February 1944, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. The P-51 Mustang, with even longer range, was beginning to supplement P-47 groups. But the Thunderbolt remained the workhorse of bomber escort. Its survivability meant it could be used for the most dangerous missions: initial penetration of German airspace, combat over heavily defended targets, suppression of German air bases. P-51s were faster and more maneuverable, better suited for dogfighting. But when the mission required an aircraft that could absorb punishment and keep fighting, commanders chose the P-47. The Big Week and the end spring 1944 brought Operation Argument, the Big Week campaign designed to destroy German fighter production. Between February 20th and 25th, combined American and British forces launched the most intensive air campaign yet seen. The 8th Air Force in England and the 15th Air Force in Italy flew approximately 3,800 heavy bomber sorties, while RAF Bomber Command added over 2,800 night sorties. Approximately 10,000 tons of bombs struck German aircraft factories. The P-47 groups bore the brunt of daylight fighter escort duties. Over 500 German fighters were destroyed during the six-day campaign. The P-47 loss rate remained under $1 per sortie. German pilots, forced to defend their airfields and factories, had no choice but to engage. They died in unprecedented numbers. After-action reports from German units following Big Week revealed growing demoralization. Pilots described hitting Thunderbolts repeatedly only to watch them continue fighting. Some German pilots began requesting transfers to other fronts. Others developed mechanical problems that kept them grounded. The Luftwaffe's personnel office investigated and discovered widespread reluctance to fly against American forces, specifically citing encounters with P-47s. The summer of 1944 brought the P-47 into a new role: ground attack. The Thunderbolt's ability to absorb damage made it ideal for low-altitude attacks on German positions. Unlike other fighters vulnerable to ground fire, the P-47 could fly through intense anti-aircraft fire, deliver its payload, and return home with battle damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Throughout June and July 1944, P-47 groups flew thousands of ground attack sorties supporting the Allied advance from Normandy. German ground forces came to dread the distinctive sound of the P-47's radial engine. They called it Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. But the term carried fear rather than simple description. Second Lieutenant Robert Harmon, flying with the 362nd Fighter Group, was attacking German positions near St. Lo on July 25th when multiple 37mm anti-aircraft shells struck his aircraft. One shell destroyed his right wing tip, removing several feet of structure. Another penetrated his engine, destroying 2 cylinders and briefly setting the engine on fire. A third struck his tail, severing elevator control cables. Harmon managed to extinguish the fire using engine shutdown and restart procedures. He regained partial control using trim tabs alone, compensating for the severed cables. He flew his crippled aircraft 150 miles back to his base in England on an engine running on 16 of 18 cylinders. The aircraft was deemed beyond repair and used for spare parts, but Harmon walked away without injury. He would fly 89 more combat missions before the war's end. Ground crews developed dark humor about the damage. They joked that the P-47 only needed 3 things to fly: an engine running on at least half its cylinders, at least one aileron working, and a pilot with the guts to fly it. The jokes reflected a deeper truth. The aircraft's toughness had become so expected that anything less than catastrophic damage was considered routine. German anti-aircraft crews, equipped with 20mm, 37mm, and 88mm guns, discovered that bringing down a P-47 required far more hits than any other Allied aircraft. Standard doctrine assumed 2 or 3 20mm hits would destroy a fighter. Against the P-47, crews reported needing 10 or more direct hits, and even then, the aircraft often made it back to Allied territory. The P-47's radial engine was particularly difficult to stop. Unlike inline engines, where a single cooling system hit caused rapid failure, the radial could lose entire cylinders and continue running. American pilots reported flying home on engines missing 3 or 4 cylinders, still producing enough power to maintain altitude. In the Pacific Theater, the P-47 served with distinction from 1943 through the war's end. The long-range P-47N variant, with its 556-gallon internal fuel capacity and wet-wing design allowing 1,166 gallons total with external tanks, was specifically developed for Pacific operations. These aircraft escorted B-29 Superfortress bombers on raids against Japan and provided ground support throughout the island-hopping campaign. The P-47's ruggedness proved equally valuable against Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The 318th Fighter Group, operating P-47s from Aishima near Okinawa, flew some of the longest fighter escort missions in history, over 1,500 miles to targets in Japan and back. The aircraft's ability to absorb battle damage and continue flying was as crucial in the Pacific as it had been in Europe. The final major air battle of the European theater occurred on January 1, 1945, Operation Bodenplatte, a desperate German attempt to destroy Allied air power on the ground. The Luftwaffe launched over 850 fighters in coordinated strikes against Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. The operation achieved some initial success, destroying 305 Allied aircraft on the ground and damaging another 190. But as Allied fighters scrambled and engaged, the results were catastrophic for the Germans. The battle lasted most of the day, sprawling across hundreds of square miles. By evening, the Luftwaffe had lost 271 aircraft destroyed, with 143 pilots killed or missing, including 3 Geschwader Commodore, 5 Gruppenkommodore, and 14 Staffelkapitane. The loss of experienced leadership was irreplaceable. P-47 groups engaged throughout the day lost aircraft primarily to ground fire during initial German strafing attacks. Not one P-47 was lost in air-to-air combat despite being outnumbered in many engagements. German pilots returning from Bodenplatte reported the same frustrating experience they had suffered throughout the war. They would hit P-47s repeatedly, see visible damage, yet watch the American fighters continue fighting. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, second highest scoring ace in history with 301 victories, all on the Eastern Front, participated in Bodenplatte. In post-war interviews, he described shooting at one P-47 with his entire ammunition load, seeing numerous strikes, yet the aircraft continued flying until he finally hit a critical component. He noted that with the same ammunition on the Eastern Front, he could have shot down 5 Russian fighters. The war ended in May 1945. The final accounting showed the P-47's extraordinary success. Over 15,683 P-47s were built during the war, more than any other American fighter except the P-51 Mustang. P-47s flew 546,000 combat sorties in the European and Mediterranean theaters. They were credited with destroying 3,752 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, plus approximately 3,000 more on the ground, for a combined total of about 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. They also destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, and 6,000 armored vehicles in ground attack missions. Most importantly, the P-47's loss rate per sortie was the lowest of any American fighter, 0.7% in the European theater. For every 1,000 sorties flown, only 7 P-47s were lost. By comparison, the P-38 Lightning lost 13 per thousand. The P-51 Mustang lost 9 per thousand. The P-47's survivability translated directly into pilot survival. Of American aviators who served in Europe, those flying P-47s had the highest survival rate of any fighter pilots. This wasn't just a statistical anomaly. It represented thousands of young men who came home to their families instead of dying over Germany. The engineering decisions that made the P-47 tough were also humanitarian decisions, though the engineers probably never framed them that way. German aces interviewed after the war uniformly expressed respect bordering on awe for the Thunderbolt's toughness. When aviation historians asked General Lieutenant Adolf Galland in post-war interviews what Allied aircraft he most respected, his answer was immediate and consistent: the P-47 Thunderbolt. Not because it was the best fighter aerodynamically. The P-51 was faster and more maneuverable. The Spitfire was more elegant, but because the Thunderbolt was nearly unkillable. You could hit it and hit it and hit it, and it would keep coming. That was psychological defeat, knowing that your best shots might not be enough. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a 176 victory ace who survived the war, despite being shot down multiple times, echoed this sentiment. The ultimate testament, survival, and the war's outcome, Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a 176 victory ace who survived the war, despite being shot down multiple times, provided perhaps the most eloquent summary in his 1970 memoir. "We learned to respect all our opponents," he wrote. The Russian pilots for their courage, the British for their determination, the Americans for their numbers, but we feared the P-47 specifically. It represented American industrial might in tangible form. It was the equivalent of a flying fortress, a machine so excessive in its protection, so overbuilt, that it defied their conception of what a fighter should be. We flew graceful, efficient, deadly machines. They flew armored fortresses, and in the end, their fortresses defeated our thoroughbreds. These subjective impressions were supported by technical data. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined thousands of combat reports, aircraft recovery records, and damage assessments. Their findings quantified what German pilots had experienced firsthand. While specific hit-to-kill ratios varied by impact location and ammunition type, the P-47 consistently required far more hits to bring down than other Allied fighters. German pilots expended more ammunition per P-47 destroyed than for any other Allied fighter type. This perfectly explains German frustration. Their aircraft carried limited ammunition, typically 200 rounds per 20mm cannon and 1,000 rounds per machine gun. A single combat sortie might result in expending most or all ammunition on one P-47, leaving them defenseless against others. Design philosophy and lasting influence. The engineering analysis revealed the specific features that created this toughness. The R2800 engine's radial configuration meant that the remaining cylinders could distribute the load and maintain power even with multiple cylinders destroyed. The massive propeller, weighing over 400 pounds, had enough rotational inertia to keep spinning, providing enough thrust to maintain flight even if the engine lost significant power. Structural redundancy meant that catastrophic structural collapse could be avoided even with primary load paths failing. The self-sealing fuel tanks could handle multiple punctures without catching fire or leaking. The armor protection covered redundant systems as well as vital areas, ensuring that backup systems would function even if primary controls were damaged. The P-47's influence on post-war fighter design was both profound and lasting. Analyzing combat data from World War II and the Korean War, the United States Air Force concluded that survivability was as important as performance in fighter design. This philosophy influenced every subsequent American fighter developed. The F-86 Sabre, F-100 Super Sabre, and F-4 Phantom all incorporated lessons from the P-47, protected vital components, redundant systems, and survivability as a design priority equal to performance. Even the Soviet Union, after conducting their own studies and capturing German analysis of the P-47, reached similar conclusions. Post-war Soviet fighters emphasized protection far more than pre-war designs had. The global evolution of fighter design shifted toward the American model, moving away from the German model of performance over protection. Modern fighter pilots, flying aircraft costing hundreds of millions of dollars, still study the P-47's combat record. The lessons remain relevant. A pilot who survives to complete the mission is more valuable than a pilot who achieves maximum performance but doesn't return. Modern aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, named explicitly in honor of the P-47, carry forward the same philosophy. Build an aircraft that can absorb enormous damage and still accomplish its mission. The A-10's titanium bathtub protecting the pilot, its redundant control systems, and its ability to fly with entire sections of the aircraft destroyed, all trace directly back to Alexander Kartveli's design philosophy in creating the original Thunderbolt, the human cost and final validation. P-47's survivability makes the human cost of the air war even more meaningful. Of the 130,000 American airmen who served in Europe during World War II, about 26,000 died in combat. The death rate varied dramatically by mission and aircraft type. P-47 pilots had approximately a $12% combat fatality rate over a full tour. P-38 pilots suffered approximately 18% fatalities, while B-17 and B-24 bomber crews endured about 20% losses. The P-47's protection directly translated into thousands of sons who returned to their mothers, thousands of young men who saw their children grow up, thousands of husbands who grew old with their wives. The engineering decisions that made the P-47 tough were decisions that saved lives. The German pilots who survived the war carried their respect for the P-47 throughout their lives. When the German Air Force was reformed in the 1950s as part of NATO, many former Luftwaffe pilots returned to service. They found themselves flying alongside American pilots, many of whom had flown P-47s against them a decade earlier. The former enemies discovered mutual respect. Germans would ask about the P-47's toughness, seeking to understand how it had been achieved. These conversations, preserved in Veteran Association newsletters and reunion documents, reveal consistent themes. The Americans admired the skill. The Germans admired the engineering. Both groups acknowledged that the P-47's survivability had been decisive, not because it won dogfights through performance, but because it won the campaign through attrition, keeping American pilots alive long enough to become dangerous, long enough to gain experience, long enough to win. In 1961, Republic Aviation Company held a reunion for former P-47 pilots. Over 2,000 attended, representing nearly every fighter group that had flown the aircraft in combat. The keynote speaker was Colonel Hubert Zemke, who had commanded the 56th Fighter Group, the top-scoring P-47 unit. His speech captured the essence of what the aircraft had meant to those who flew it. We didn't fly the fastest fighter. We didn't fly the most maneuverable fighter. We didn't fly the prettiest fighter. We flew the fighter that brought us home. He continued. The Thunderbolt was built by people who understood that. They gave us protection when we needed it most. They gave us the confidence to press the attack because we knew no matter what happened, the Jug would get us home. The nickname Jug, short for Juggernaut, perfectly captured the aircraft's essence. It was inevitable, relentless, and unstoppable. German pilots learned to fear that inevitability. They could stream fuel, damage it, and make it smoke, but they couldn't stop it. The psychological dimension of the P-47's toughness was as important as the physical dimension. German pilots lost confidence. They avoided combat when possible. They disengaged early. The entire tactical posture of the Luftwaffe changed in response to an aircraft that simply remained airborne no matter what was thrown at it. The final assessment belongs to Oberstleutnant Heinz Bär, the third highest scoring German ace, who provided this evaluation in a 1957 interview. When asked what he thought had been the most important Allied weapon of the war, his answer surprised the interviewer. Not the B-17, not the atomic bomb, not even the P-51 with its long range. The P-47 Thunderbolt, he stated, because it kept their pilots alive. Everything else follows from that. If you lose your pilots, you lose your Air Force. If you lose your Air Force, you lose the war. The Americans understood this fundamental truth. We didn't, not until too late. He concluded, "We built beautiful, fast, deadly fighters optimized for performance. They built a flying fortress optimized for survival. Their flying fortress defeated our fighters because wars are won by survivors, not by dead heroes, no matter how skilled or brave. The P-47 created survivors. It created the men who defeated us." This admission from one of Germany's greatest aces represents the ultimate validation of the P-47's design philosophy. The Thunderbolt didn't just protect pilots. It created the generation of aviators who won the air war. The P-47 proved that the best fighter is not the one that wins dogfights through superior performance, but the one that wins wars by keeping pilots alive. The German aces learned this lesson the hard way, watching their tactical advantages dissolve against an enemy that would not be stopped. The simple fact that the German aces shot it full of holes and it kept flying decided the outcome of the air war over Europe. The Thunderbolt was not the fastest, not the most maneuverable, and not the longest ranged, but it was the toughest. In the brutal mathematics of aerial combat, toughness was the quality that mattered most.